Well, everyone out there listening to myself, Jeff Black, my beautiful co-host, the Brandon DeCruz. We are Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness Podcast. Thank you for joining us. Episode 83 today. So, how to build muscle and lose fat at the same time. The Body Recomp Blueprint, Part 1, Nutrition for Recomping. So, as we continue to build out, as we often do on the show here, topics over time, we're going to continue to go down the recomp little pathway with you all today. And I know Brandon's probably got a doozy together, considering he's just no longer in school, so he's bored probably. Even though he says he's not, I'm like bored. I know you're bored.
Man, I will tell you, I'm going to be honest with you. I have never, and this is me being incredibly objective and honest with you, I have never experienced boredom ever in my life. And that is coming as an only child. I think that might stem from the fact that I was engaged in so many activities as a kid. My mom was literally running me from one sport to another to another. Like I did track, karate. I competed in martial arts contests. Every weekend we'd go to a road race. I was a Boy Scout. I was an Eagle Scout by the time I was 14. So, I was in honor societies and things like that. Even college, I graduated high school. I went to project graduation the day after graduating, and I started my first college class the day after that. So I've literally never had a break in any aspect of my life. So I'll tell you, I don't experience boredom, but I will say that I am able to channel a lot of my intellectual interests into not only coaching, obviously chasing academic, continuing education, but also into the podcast itself. I think that's an expression of me as an educator and also as someone that's just intellectually curious. This allows me a platform to educate others, and I really enjoy that. I mean, that is something, I come from, I have a family that it's a teaching background. My aunt, the first internship, I'll say this, the first internship I ever did, and it was throughout high school, was at a medical university. My aunt is a dean at a medical school, and she was a college professor, as were multiple, other family members of mine. And I think that their impact and influence on me has really caused me to like this. And I like educating others. I like getting, to be able to cover topics in depth. Like I've kind of almost shied away more from social media. I still do my social media, my daily post, because that was a commitment I made to myself and my audience years ago. But this is a platform where I get to speak a little bit more openly, get a little bit more in depth, and really provide more context and nuance to topics that often we just don't have the ability to do so on social media. There's a lot of not only are you on a thread, you're on a timeline where you may say something and someone says something exactly counter, to the contrary that you do, or whatever it may be. And there's a lot of, there's essentially an inability to really get deep with people. Like I comment back to everyone that comments on my post, but it's like, how much can I do through, a caption or, a reply that is, 3 or 4 sentences long. So this is really an outlet that we have to be able to really engage in long form content as well as long form conversation.
Well, I felt really inadequate hearing how successful you are. We were hearing once I heard Eagle Scout, I was like, well, fuck. Brandon just beat
Dude,
me.
I was a youngest in the state of New Jersey at one time. I was 14 years old, and I had the most merit badges in my county. So this is just, it kind of comes back to, this is just a character trait. Like, and I always say this, I tell this to my clients, like, how you do anything is how you do everything. So if you are someone that stays committed to something, like, you should see everything throughout. And I think that's a characteristic that really brings you and I together, because regardless of the obstacles that you faced in your life, whether it was, people telling you were going to fail at a gym, people telling you that you were going to not be able to coach successfully, or even like just recently, this past, let's go back to just this January of this past year, where doctors told you you were not going to lift, you weren't going to compete, and you just proved people wrong. So you put your all into everything, as do I. Mine is, obviously we channel things into different sectors or different vectors, essentially. Mine is more, I guess, an educational pursuit at this point, because I am years removed from the stage, and that's not something that really piques my interest anymore. I really enjoy training. I like dieting. Like right now I'm in a mini cut, but I think that my curiosity, the reason that I study so much, the reason that I go so in depth on so many topics, is really like, my whole focus is being the best coach possible. That's the only thing that, I'm not going to say the only thing, but that is my top priority in my life right now, where I am. You're decades into your career. I know that we're almost like transitioning into different sectors of our lives, or different chapters, essentially. Like you're able to reel yourself back, and I'm really happy for you that you're able to actually, since the time I know you, when we first, became friends, you were working 7 days a week. And then all of a sudden one day you told me, one week you were like, I'm going to pull back to 6 days a week. And now you're back to 5 days a week. And there's times that you take, Friday, Saturday, Sunday off. And I completely respect that. But I always remind myself, Jeff's at a different point in his journey than I am. So
Yep.
I'm working 7 days a week. each and every fucking week. I've been doing that for a decade, and I'm probably got to have at least a half decade more of doing so. And that's fine by me.
Yeah, man. I mean, that's what like I try to remind myself this because I feel guilty that I don't work as hard as I used to. I'm like, well, I'm like 19 years down the road come April. And I'm like, by this point, it's kind of built in and kind of goes. And that's why I'm like, when you get to a certain point in business, you learn to where to put your energy in.
Mhm.
Andy Frisell and Ed Milet talked about this episode, and then let's get into our last 7 days real briefly and get into this. They talked about the rooms, and when you're in business, it's like the room year is like 0 to 5. You talk shit on each other. 5 to 10, like it's less of you, and you're kind of cooler, but you don't talk as much shit. And then you get to like 10 to 15, and then you're kind of like, all right, man, there's not many of you left. You look at each other like, all right, let's. You start getting better, and then like once you kind of get into like the room with more age, you're looking on how like you can help each other. And I can say that's true, man, where I'm at my point in my career. I can think I walked through that whole journey. And I tell everybody when they go into business, I'm like, look, man, I go, you're going to look back at yourself in your journey and be like, holy shit, I really was capable of doing all those things. And then the same cuss going like, holy shit, I was really capable of thinking those things because you just really evolve in so many ways. But that's a topic for another day. But, I will say this, Brandon, it was nice to take off Friday and go see Metallica
Good for you,
in
my man.
St. Louis. It was interesting, dude. Keegan like cried at the end of Pantera Walk. I was like, bro, why are you crying? He's like, this is my favorite song. And so like in the car went back, I'm like, bro, I didn't know that was his favorite song. He's like, well, you never asked me. And I was like, well, fair point. Because I mean, because Keegan's like Howard, dude, Keegan is in like Memphis gangster rap. Like, I mean, the beats
Interesting.
that are like, and then they're like, I'm going to crawl up and kill you and shit and with my Tech Nine. And like, Keegan, hardcore gangster rap fan. Like, the
Merc
stuff.
rap.
Oh, yeah, I guess. I call it murder rap because that's all they talk about. That's all they rap about. Every time he plays the song, I'm like, oh, some more people died, But anyway, and it just didn't have him like that song and see that emotional response was super cool. Like I
That's
really
dope, man.
enjoyed that. Yeah. And then otherwise, this is good. I found someone to actually publish my book. Has in the
Yes.
hard copies. So I'll be selling them on my website. So if you all are interested, that will be coming out soon. I'll be hand signing them, and to Brandon, I'm going to write him a lovely note. So if you would
I
like,
better get in. No, no, no. I want a signed copy, but I also
sure.
want a picture of you in there.
What?
I want you to take a picture and put it in there, just like, I'll send you out some of my books. I
Uh,
will send you a personal picture of me, like almost like the cover shot that was used on the cover, but the raw image,
the
just so
raw
you feel
image?
special.
Oh my God, ladies and gentlemen, I can
I'll
hang.
have you with the sultry look. I'll hit you with the blue
Oh
steel.
my
It'll be over.
God. Blue Steel? Holy shit. I will hang that in my back corner and I won't need an OnlyFans to pay my life. But anyway, that was pretty much my last 7 days, been kind of working that angle. How's your last seven?
Man, my last 7 days have been extremely busy, yet productive. And business is going really well. All those things, all fronts, in terms of clients and stuff, they're being taken care of. And I'm really happy the trajectory of how my business is going, especially since I finished this course and now I'm looking towards graduation. It's crazy. I graduated in 11 days and it feels like I just started this program, and that was a year and a half ago. So it's cool to be seeing this chapter through. But right now, in terms of like training and nutrition, I'm currently 2 weeks into this mini cut phase that I'll be running. And essentially the projection of this was a 4.5 week mini cut so that I'm done with the mini cut by the time Thanksgiving comes around. So really the goal is to drop off some body fat that I accumulated in my last building phase and also to restore my appetite and my digestion by then. And right now I'm getting hungry. So the appetite almost checked off. Digestion still working on some things just to make sure that I'm able to, digestion is so important. A lot of people overlook like gas and bloating and things of that sort. And they don't want to talk about that. Those aren't sexy topics, but really you aren't what you eat, but rather what you digest, assimilate, and absorb. So that could be from protein kinetics, like if you're not actually able to assimilate protein because you don't have the hydrochloric acid production to be able to break down and really deaminate those proteins and essentially get them into amino acids into the bloodstream, you're not going to maximize muscle hypertrophy. So in terms of that, I'm really working on those two vectors while dropping the body fat. But even just 2 weeks in, I'm feeling much better from a biofeedback perspective, especially from that hunger. Because I'll tell you, as soon as, I don't want to say as soon, but when I'm at the end of a building phase or the last few months, as soon as I get over like that 4,000 calorie range, I just start to feel sluggish. And it's not only like from the digestion and the appetite perspective, but also like my cognition is kind of impaired, which is really interesting because a lot of times people will say that they feel like a lack of cognition when they're dieting. I feel the exact opposite, and the research actually bears that out. And what I experience is like a feeling of becoming sluggish. So that's essentially what we would refer to as postprandial somnolence, which is that's the technical term for the feeling of becoming tired and sleepy after eating. So a lot of times, if you went out to a all-you-can-eat sushi restaurant or to a buffet, you feel like you're like bogged down. Well, I feel like that after every meal, even without hyperpalatable, really energy dense food sources. And really, when we look into it, I find this topic fascinating because I have this conversation with a lot of clients as they're going through building phases. Um, the fact that we do experience the sluggishness, and I work with a lot of entrepreneurs, other business owners, and things of that sort. So it is something I try to keep a tab on. But we see in the research on postprandial somnolence that it's usually related to the amount of calories you eat in a meal, not the amount of carbohydrates. So a lot of times people really like correlate this with like a carb coma, but it isn't. If you have a low calorie meal but you have a high carbohydrate amount in there, it's not that it's the carbs that are creating exhaustion or tiredness. This is essentially the same thing that you feel after a Thanksgiving meal, which many of us will be experiencing in the next couple of weeks. But it's really the larger meals will increase the likelihood of experience this. So once I personally find that once I get to the ending stages, the latter half or the latter quarter of a building phase, I notice that meals are sitting a lot heavier in me from a digestion perspective, but they also tend to slow me down both mentally and physically. So I've been able to reduce those feelings already just being in this mini cut the last 2 weeks. So I'm happy about that. I try to look on the positives of things. So yes, I'm experiencing hunger, but or a little bit lack of energy, in terms of my daily energy levels. However, I'm feeling much better after meals. I'm able to get right back into work, really be sharp cognitively and intellectually. So, for every gimme, there's a gotcha, as I always say. So right now, everything in my world is going well. Right now, we just had a drop. So last week it was 70 degrees in Jersey, which is really warm for Jersey during this time of year. It is currently 42 degrees. So yeah, it's we've had a substantial drop to say the least. But you know what? That's winter, and I'm looking forward. I'm gonna be taking a trip out to Arizona in January to visit one of my close clients and good friend Jeremiah Bear, and then I will be seeing you in Tennessee the first week of February. So my winter, the really bear of the season, when it's really cold, I'm going to be able to get into some warm weather climates because Arizona is beautiful during the winter, and I know that Tennessee is as well. So I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I just want you to relish in the fact that I am enjoying a very blissful 76 degrees here today and
Hey,
sunny.
God bless.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's rough life here in Nashville. All right, let's get into this. So, how to build muscle, lose fat at the same time. This is the number one thing that anyone who ever talks to me in my gym or just anywhere will ever talk about, the ability to do these two magical, mystical things at once. So Brandon's going to go over the body recomp blueprint. We're going to talk about part one, which is nutrition for recomping. So I'll pepper in as usual, as I want to maybe give my old man wisdom. But Brandon, are you ready to be beautiful right now? Are you ready to shine like the star you are? All right. So let's get into the nutritional principles for body recomposition.
Absolutely, my man. So on last week's podcast, we covered the topic of body recomposition, which is essentially the holy grail of body composition improvement. And we specifically dug into whether or not, body composition can occur in, other trained individuals. So if someone's well trained, or if it's something that can only occur in those who are either new to training, so newbies or beginners, or those who are obese. And throughout that podcast, we covered not only our own experience, having helped many well trained clients that we've worked with, Recomp, but also, we covered the large body of literature we have on the topic, which finds that well-trained individuals can recomp, but there's a degree of, or there's some specific things that we need to dial in. So we need to make sure that their nutrition is dialed in, their training, their sleep, and their stress management practices. So, on today's episode, we're going to cover the role that nutrition plays in the body recomposition process and what are the most important nutritional factors and principles to pay attention to when you're aiming to recomp. Because this is an approach, because keep in mind, fat loss is a difficult process in and of itself, as is muscle building. And so, when we're trying to do both at the same time, we need to pay more attention to detail. And that's really where some of the more nuanced aspects of nutrition, specifically today, but also in our second part, so next week, we will go through some of the training principles and some of the lifestyle factors that we need to take into consideration and really dial in to have a all-encompassing program that's multifaceted and really is going to allow you to have the highest propensity or the highest likelihood of accomplishing the goal of recomposition or, of losing body fat while gaining muscle.
Beautiful. So then, what is the number one nutrition misconception pertaining to body recomp?
All right, so
I like that sounds freaking mystical as hell to me. So I'm just like, where is my unicorn that's going to run out on this one?
No, for real. So there's many nutritional misconceptions that run rampant in this industry, but I think the biggest one is it really stems back to the fact that many have this reductionist mindset when it comes to gaining muscle, where they say that you have to be in a calorie surplus to gain muscle. And this is another one of those fitness industry claims or myths that does have some truth to it, but it's more so a simple story for those who would rather provide black and white answers to the questions they receive rather than providing more detailed and nuanced answers that consider the context of the situation and the individual that we're speaking to or that we're working with. And this is kind of what I was alluding to in the intro, where I really like the format or the platform of podcasting because we're able to get into more nuanced topics. We're able to tease out a lot more details in terms of, a question that a listener or client may have for us. Whereas in a social media post or in an email, a lot of times it's very difficult to be able to get into that amount of granularity. Whereas, like, if I was in the gym and someone asked me one of these questions, if I have the time and I'm not mid training or mid set, where some people will just come up and ask you questions. You're like in the middle of a set and you're like,
Do
"Hey man,
people
can you
do
give me a
that
minute?"
to you?
They do. And so
What?
I go to the gym very early to avoid that because I am someone that
Oh,
by nature, I do like engaging with people, but I also know that I do have ADD. So I need to really lock myself in, really stay focused, put my hood up, put on a big pair of headphones like I have on right now, and try to black out the world. But really, when it comes down to it, this is why I like um, the ability to podcast because we're able to really get into more of the nuances. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for simplifying concepts, but building muscle is about far more than just being in a calorie surplus and in a state of positive energy balance. So, although it is true that in order to gain weight, you need to be in a surplus of calories and taking in more energy than you're burning, that specifically applies to weight gain, not specifically to muscle growth. And this is because muscle growth is a signaling dependent process that's most robustly stimulated by providing our muscles and our body with a progressive training stimulus. So going to the gym and really challenging ourselves. And then when we combine that with sufficient protein intake, we're able to maximize the process of muscle protein synthesis, which is what is needed to put ourselves in a place where we're going to be able to gain muscle. And this is important because muscle growth requires being in what's called a state of positive protein balance, where our rates of muscle protein synthesis exceed our rates of muscle protein breakdown. And this doesn't always require being in a state of positive energy balance, which is why it's possible to gain muscle and lose fat in a slight deficit. And I've seen this happen in many clients of mine, ranging from beginners to even more advanced trainees. So, as I mentioned last week in the podcast, I have a client right now, Grant, who's been training 3 decades at this point. He just turned 49 years old. He's a fitness professional himself, a business owner, a CEO, a founder of a wellness company, and he has been able to attain a substantial degree of body recomposition throughout the last 20-week phase that we had together. And it's something that's been really impressive, but it's because we've been so detail oriented and we've turned up every vector needed to be able to elicit that type of change. So this isn't to say that you're going to be able to maximize your muscle growth potential and put on slabs of muscle mass in a deficit, but you can add muscle. So we have to differentiate. We have to differentiate between maximizing muscle growth, which would be most heavily benefited by being in a surplus, and then also the difference between gaining muscle mass and not maximizing it. But in terms of a body recomposition, you're getting some fat loss and you're getting some muscle mass, and that can be done in a deficit. But you can add muscle while losing fat if you optimize the variables within your programming to allow this to occur. So, despite what many people may think, you can build muscle in a deficit as long as you provide an adequate stimulus from your training to cause enough of an adaptation to grow. However, this also needs to be combined with a nutritional approach that complements your training. So, it pairs both your nutrition and your training and a lifestyle that is conducive for maximizing recovery, because that is the best of all worlds. Like, we need to combine the best of each type of programming variable and vector to be able to really maximize this process so that you can actually attain and achieve the goal of building muscle and losing body fat.
Okay, so then what is principle number, or I guess let's get into this. So we have three principles. So principle number one, calorie intake for body recomp. I guess this is where the maintenance, the deficits, the surpluses, kind of have this conversation. Let's get rolling.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'll tell you what I do personally, in terms of the calorie intake approach. So I personally take a phasic approach to achieving body recomposition with my clients. So what I like to do is I like to start the body recomposition phase off at their maintenance calorie intake. And then once we get things dialed in and I've collected data on how this individual is responding to the program, I'll then transition them into a slight deficit. And the reason why I like to start clients off at their maintenance calorie intake is that I want to make sure and I want to ensure that they're sufficiently fueled, but then I'm dialing in multiple aspects and details of their nutrition. So I'm looking at optimizing their macronutrient intake. I'm looking at, dialing in their protein intake as well as their protein distribution. So it's not about just total macros or total protein intake. It's how do I distribute that across the day and ensure that we're maximizing muscle protein synthesis at multiple time points throughout the day to put them in a state of anabolism. I'm looking at nutrient timing and including, pre and post workout fueling into their approach. I'm looking at their micronutrient intake. I'm trying to fill in the gaps that they might have had, previous to coming to me. Because a lot of times I notice that many people, when I do their nutritional intake, they have glaring micronutrient, gaps essentially in their diet. So they might be overfueled in terms of overnourished or overfed essentially. So they're taking an excess amount of calories. They're in a surplus, they're gaining weight, but they're undernourished. They don't have adequate micronutrient intake due to poor food quality. And then I also may add in some specific supplements that help with increasing lean mass and decreasing fat mass, which allows, once I dial in all these different variables at maintenance, it allows their same maintenance intake to be optimized. And then we're focusing on improving training performance to drive muscular adaptations and build muscle. So I first start off the phase at a maintenance amount, and then I try to get a good amount of body composition progress at this maintenance intake before I transition them into a slight deficit because it's easier to gain muscle while eating at maintenance. And often during this portion of the recomp phase, my client's weight will stay relatively unchanged. But here's the thing. If your weight has stayed the same, but your training performance is improving, you're getting stronger in the gym, and you're gaining muscle, then by proxy, you've lost body fat as that fat was used to fuel the muscle growth process. So say we have a client and they're 150 pounds and 20% body fat at the start of a body recomp phase. That means you have 30 pounds of fat mass on your frame and 120 pounds of lean mass. But if you build 5 pounds of lean mass during this body recomposition phase, yet you stay at 150 pounds, so your weight stays the same, but you build 5 pounds of muscle, that means that you now have 125 pounds of lean mass and 25 pounds of fat mass. So you now have more total lean mass, less total fat mass, and now you have a lower body fat percentage. So your body composition looks different, but you've also lost body fat. And often towards the second half of a body recomp phase, I'll transition a client into a deficit, but this is going to be a slight and a small deficit as I want them to be able to continue building muscle. And so the degree or severity of the deficit we use will influence whether we can gain muscle, we maintain muscle, or we lose muscle, with muscle loss being something that we want to avoid at all costs, which is why I'm not an advocate or a big fan of aggressive deficits. And this is something that we covered in, what is the right deficit for fat loss or how to optimize your deficit, the most effective deficit for fat loss. I think it was named. It's one of the podcasts in the 70s, either 74 or 75. And when we're using smaller calorie deficits and using a slower rate of loss target, we have a higher likelihood of building muscle. So this is why I'll usually lean into using a smaller deficit with my clients. And so that's how I've seen the best body recomposition results. That's how, even in the literature, that's what's bared out. But Jeff, I would love to hear your opinion on how you have been able to attain body recomposition. Are you utilizing maintenance? Are you going right into a deficit? Are you using, I know sometimes you'll use like an amount of calories per pound of someone's body weight. So I would love to hear your feedback on that.
So, like if you're getting someone like, I'll just use a regular gym pop person, a lot of it's trying to figure out like them understanding where they need to eat to kind of like hold their weight, right? And I like to work with them on that. So for me, I usually begin if I'm giving them some targets to go with body weight times 10 and making protein easy, 1 gram per pound of lean body mass, penciling in the rest from there. And then once they start gaining like a little bit of weight and like you can see it going over 30 days, then that kind of lets me know I'm more in that surplus range. And then from there, I start tweaking it down until you can very visually see that they're dropping body fat. And then they're giving you the markers in the gym, like they're gaining muscle, they're getting stronger, they're improving on their recovery. There's just things that are changing. And yet the scale's still going down. They're still dropping body fat. And that's why I kind of know they're in that magical recomp zone. I am like you. I don't like the aggressive calorie cuts because I've seen sometimes where I'll just pull 20 or 30 grams from someone and they'll move enough like in the direction they were before. So I've seen people respond to all sorts of stuff. And I've seen others need like 50 and 60 grams of something taken off to respond. So I think when you're going to find this magical recomp, you have to do your diligence to know what you're tracking. And that way you can
100%.
really understand where you're at. This isn't, I can intuitively eat and decide what I need to recomp. This is a recomp is work. I would dare say is equally as hard work as preparing for a show. because you have the off season where you have to prepare for your show that's one in the when it comes time to compete. But really, recomp is its own plan you have to attack. Like you can't let off of it. You got to really you've got this, like, I guess, beautiful super compensation state, almost like your body is just beautifully golden, and take advantage of that magic when you get there. So many people rush things. Like, you get people be like, I need to rush this phase because I need to get to my deficit. And they'll be like, look, I was in maintenance for 2 weeks. And I'm like, huh, okay. You know what I mean? Like, that's
And
nice,
then the issue with that is that often it's those that do that have the longest and most chronic history of dieting. So what ends up
Mhm.
happening is those same individuals will rush the maintenance phase and they'll say, all right, well, I ate at an adequate of energy availability or an adequate maintenance calorie intake for 2 weeks. I want to get right back into dieting,
Mhm.
but they haven't sustained a long enough period of increased energy availability to reverse the metabolic adaptations that they had sustained from their previous diet. So then what ends up happening is they decide, let's go back into a deficit, and they force their way. They either force, a coach's hand, or they decide on their own, listen, I'm going to go back to dieting. I gained a little fluff from being at maintenance from, they're thinking it's body fat, but in reality, it's just an increase in a restoration in muscle glycogen and some water that is associated with that. And then they go back into a deficit. And then all of a sudden, they're 2 weeks into a deficit and their body's no longer responding. And what they think they have is metabolic resistance or fat loss resistance. And they think that there's something physiologically wrong with you. And that isn't the case. It's that you were still metabolically adapted from your previous diet. So now your body is downregulating energy expenditure more precipitously because it's going back into a conservation mode. It wants to conserve energy because you didn't give it enough time of increased energy intake where it could, upregulate many of the systems, whether it's your NEAT levels getting upregulated or it's your hormonal status. Like there's different time courses of recovery from T3, T4, to your sex hormones, which take multiple months. Sometimes it's 3 to 6 months to see a restoration in sex hormones like testosterone, estradiol, and progesterone. And this is being in an optimal state of energy availability, not just at maintenance, maybe like maintenance plus. And so a lot of times people will think that there's something wrong with them when in reality, it's not something physiologically wrong with you. Yes, there are some rate limiters on your ability to drop body fat, but that's more so because the approach you took and your psychology behind it is causing more of these barriers than are necessary because you didn't give yourself enough time, you didn't put in enough time, effort, and patience within the process to reverse the it's not damage, but it's rather the repercussions of your previous dieting phases.
Yeah, that's something interesting. Like, I'll sometimes, they'll like really push me for a cut. I'll be like, okay. And then they see it doesn't work. I'm like, do you care to go the other way? And then they're like, fine. Especially if they've been doing it diligently. And like crossing their fingers, hope to die kind of shit. But anyway, what size of a deficit can we use and still gain muscle? I'll be curious on this one. I think it's probably close to the line. And there's so many nuances that, like, just I become fickle the older I get. When somebody like, look, my watch that burn 900 calories and da 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 da. And I'm like, all right, well, what does your little noon thing say that you blow into? Are you metabolically active?
Dear
But
Lord.
anyway, I'm curious, like, what size of a deficit can we use to still gain muscle? And I guess my next question would be, this is, I assume, we're assuming for the not, this is completely non-enhanced people because this does not apply. So don't hit me with that shit.
Yeah, so I'll be honest with you. When it comes to someone that is enhanced, we just don't have data on that. There
Nope,
aren't people
nothing.
that are willing to really subject themselves to research testing, and a lot of times there's a lack of transparency within that. And I understand the issues with that due to legalities and things of that sort, and just not wanting to disclose maybe what you're taking. Are you taking metabolic, fat loss drugs and things of that sort, or metabolic modulators essentially? And so we don't have data on that. So I'm not going to postulate or even try to guesstimate that. But this is something that has really interested me, that whole topic of what size of a deficit can you use and still lose body fats or still lose body fat and gain muscle. So this is something that over my years coaching, I've looked into many times and I've collected a lot of data on my own clients. So this is anecdata, so anecdotal data. But then we just recently had some research that has really shed more light onto this topic. So I'll tell you personally, over my years coaching, I found that the most of my clients recomp the most when I use a slower rate of loss target with them of around 0.5% rate of body weight loss per week or lower. So, for instance, if I have a 200-pound male client, that would be an average rate of loss of around 1 pound per week or less. And for a 150-pound female, that would be around a three-quarter of a pound per week rate of loss or less. So I'm looking at not going above those, essentially those parameters to be able to recomp. So in practice, I found that using between, say, a 100 and a 400 calorie deficit to work best for body recomposition. And this really comes back to, what I've seen in the trenches, but I'll tell you, for years, I looked into literature to try to find some data that would substantiate what I was seeing with clients in the real world. And it actually took until a couple years ago to actually see a study that it was really well done and really was able to allude or really elucidate some more data on this topic. So in 2021, there was a meta-analysis and meta-regression that was conducted to determine the impact that being in an energy deficit has on lean mass gains from resistance training. So, in order to do this, researchers looked at studies where individuals were in a calorie deficit and resistance training. And then they looked at what size of a deficit still allowed these resistance trained individuals to gain muscle and lose fat. And then where they started to see muscle, to not see muscle gains, and even where, like, what was the line at which they started to see muscle loss. So within this meta-analysis and meta-regression, they found that on average, that dieters were able to gain lean mass during a deficit of up to around 500 calories per day. But when the size of the deficit went beyond that 500 calorie deficit mark, that muscle gain, they essentially found that muscle gain was far less likelihood. And then it kind of turned to the other side of the equation, that over, say, it was really over like 600 calorie deficit, we really start seeing that the likelihood of muscle loss increases. So they basically found that in studies where resistance trained individuals dieted using a daily deficit lower than 500 calories per day, they had a greater likelihood for gaining muscle while losing fat. When using a 500 calorie deficit per day, they were able to maintain all their lean mass while losing fat. But in deficits much larger than 500 calories per day is when lean mass loss started to becoming visible. Now, this 500 calorie deficit cutoff, where we stopped seeing noticeable gains of muscle mass, was the average across all the studies and across groups. But this may differ from person to person based on their starting level of body fat at the start of a deficit, their total body weight, and really how much fat mass they have on their frame they need to lose, their training age and their experience, their sex. We've spoken about last week in the podcast how females may have a higher likelihood to recomp according to a lot of the data, and then also my personal experience working with many females. And also, we also need to consider how robust of a training stimulus the client that we're working with has, because keep in mind that we just covered on a podcast the individual responses to resistance training. Well, I'm catering my resistance training and I'm pairing it with the nutrition we're utilizing. That isn't how it's done in a research study. It's utilizing a generic program. We need to consider what that client's genetics are and what their response to training is like. Because if we have a hyper responder, they're going to be much more likely to recomp or build muscle while being in a deficit. We need to look at their diet and their macronutrient composition and what it looks like. Because if someone's utilizing a low protein diet, we say that in many areas of the research that you are far less likely to not only build muscle, but also to even maintain muscle while being in a deficit. We need to look at their sleep quality and their sleep quantity. And we also have to consider how high their stress levels are. So if you're trying to build muscle while losing fat, you will need to be in an energy deficit. Yet the larger the deficit gets, the harder it'll be to gain muscle while dropping body fat, which is where running a smaller and less aggressive deficit can be effective, as it can help maintain training performance or even progress your training performance to the point where you can build muscle and recomp as a result. So when it comes to the goal of recomping, I aim to create a deficit that's effective, but also is realistic and reasonable for the client and their goals. And I've personally found that by using a smaller deficit with clients during a recomp phase, they're able to train more intensely and in a manner that is more conducive for muscle growth. They feel better and they have better biofeedback. They function better day to day and are able to keep their activity levels up, which helps maintain an effective deficit. So it doesn't have to all come from, food, because we're keeping their NEAT levels up. And then they're also able to end the phase having gained muscle and lost body fat, or at least having maintained all their muscle mass while losing a significant amount of fat, both of which allow them to accomplish the goal of body recomposition.
Okay, so then principle number 2, protein intake for body recomp. This is one when I usually just talk with people and they start eating protein. Like most, I'm honestly shocked at times. Like I had a woman like a couple weeks ago. I was like, hey, just come bring me something, because I was like a few days before I was seeing her. I was like, give me an idea of what you eat. She had like tracked 31 to 35 grams of protein every single day and was like 50 something years old. She
Wow.
didn't know any better, right? And and,
Absolutely.
and that's the thing. Like I tell everybody, when we often talk in our space, a lot of us try to talk at a really high level, and it's so high that it's almost like you need to attend the master class to understand it, right? And a
Mhm.
lot of people don't even understand the basic of protein and like what it does for just their future as they age. So let's get into that, because this is probably a huge one, I assume, for body recomp, as I will know, but be interested to hear your take, my friend.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to the goal of recomping, the most important macronutrient to dial in is our protein intake. So that's always where I start with my clients. And this is because dietary protein stimulates the process of muscle protein synthesis, which is a necessary component and process that we need to go through to be able to build muscle. Protein also has the highest thermic effect of feeding, which allows us to burn more calories during the process of digesting and assimilating, protein than we do any other macronutrient that we can eat. And it also helps to increase satiety and manage hunger more effectively during a deficit. So it also helps with the adherence perspective of successfully being able to stick to a body recomposition phase. And one of the best quality meta-analysis that we have on protein intake and muscle growth was done by Rob Morin at a Stu Phillips lab back in 2018. And this is something that Eric Helms is on, Bill Campbell, like many of these prominent researchers that are friends of the show and that have been on the show before, they were all, contributing authors to this meta-analysis. And what they found, what their meta-analysis found, was that a range of 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram was associated with significant gains in fat-free mass in resistance-trained individuals. So this 2.2 grams per kilogram protein intake recommendation is generally the minimum that I set clients at during a recomp phase, as protein is the most important macronutrient in the diet when it comes to stimulating muscle protein synthesis to help build muscle and also to lower muscle protein breakdown to accelerate recovery while also increasing satiety and also managing blood sugar. So it has metabolic benefits as well. However, what we have to keep in mind, and this is really where research dissemination and scientific communication really comes in handy or really comes into play, is that we have to look at the conditions in which a study, was conducted or a meta-analysis in this case. And this meta-analysis didn't look at studies where participants were in a calorie deficit. So that's where looking at the actual studies we have on the topic of body recomposition can help further refine our protein intake recommendations even further. So there are multiple studies that have found that protein intakes higher than the standard 2.2 grams per kilogram recommendation lead to greater rates and more significant degrees of body recomposition. So, for example, in a 2018 study conducted by one of our previous guests, Dr. Bill Campbell, his lab found that intakes of above 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram per day led to more significant body comp results. And so in this study, they took aspiring female physique athletes and they split them up into a high protein and a low protein intake group. So both groups of females trained using the same training program, but the only difference was that the high protein group had to hit at least 2.4 grams per kilogram per day, whereas the low protein group couldn't eat more than 1.2 grams per kilogram per day. So at the end of the study, when they did like the analyses and they saw the averages, they found that the high protein group ended up averaging 2.5 grams per kilogram of protein per day and gained significantly more fat free mass and lost significantly more fat mass. And their body weight ended up going up by a pound. However, they actually lost 2.4 pounds of fat mass and gained 4.6 pounds of fat free mass. And then in a 2016 study, researchers compared the same energy deficit using two different protein intakes. So they had a low protein group that ate 1.2 grams per kilogram per day and a high protein group that ate 2.4 grams per kilogram per day. And the high protein group ended up attaining a much more significant degree of body recomposition by losing over 10 pounds of fat mass and gaining close to 3 pounds of muscle. Then in another study, this is a 2015 study by Jose Antonio, they took well-trained and healthy, individuals and put them into two different protein intake groups. And the normal protein intake group ate 2.3 grams per kilogram per day, whereas the high protein intake group ate 3.4 grams of protein per day, which comes out to roughly around 1.5 grams per pound per day. So there's a very high protein intake. What they found was the high protein intake group ended up gaining the same amount of fat free mass, which was 3.3 pounds, but they lost significantly more fat mass and body fat, having lost 3.7 pounds of fat mass and 2.4% of body fat. And then in 2020, there was a systematic review and meta-analysis which looked at, and essentially what they did was they found a dose-response relationship between protein intake and muscle mass accrual by analyzing 105 studies where they found that as daily protein intake increases, so does the change or the increase in muscle mass. And so what they found was between 1.5 to 2 grams per kilogram, the change in muscle mass starts to slow down. And for every increase in protein above that, what they found was it still increases. It's just a little bit slower. So from 1.5 to all the way up to 3.5 grams per kilogram per day, they still saw increases in muscle mass. And so overall, we see that intakes above 2.2 grams per kilogram may be more beneficial for the goal of gaining muscle while losing fat in a deficit. So this was really the protein intake that will help optimize body recomposition.
Okay, so then I want to get into the principle, which is number 3. So you went over the protein. By the way, that was an interesting little study. And then it's time for the nutrient. timing for body recomp.
Sir. And so another nutritional approach that is beneficial for the goal of body recomposition is our nutrient timing. So this is something we covered in depth. We did a 3-part series on pre-workout nutrition, intra-workout nutrition, and post-workout nutrition. So anyone that has yet to listen to that study, those podcasts, that was done in the spring of this past year. So definitely go back. We go in depth. I go through all the research behind it, and I'm going to touch on a little bit different research today. However, that's going to give you an all-encompassing view and insight into the topic of nutrient timing. But just like a little recap, the goal of nutrient timing is to organize our meals, our macros, and our calories in a way that maximizes muscle gain and or retention and fuels our training performance and our recovery capacity. And many individuals in the nutrition industry seem to have like this narrow-minded viewpoint on nutrient timing. And they kind of like make it sound like it doesn't matter. But I've always disagreed with this philosophy or this ideology, especially when it comes to the peri-workout nutrition window, which includes our pre and our post-workout nutrition. And I've seen hundreds of clients who are dieting that when we focus on prioritizing nutrients, especially protein and carbs around the workout perimeter, it's extremely beneficial, especially when they're in a deficit and they're glycogen depleted. And this is because timing things properly allows for better training sessions, better performance, which allows you to lift heavier loads and accrue more training volume, which sends a greater signal to the body to build and or maintain muscle tissue despite being in this calorie deficit. So when it comes to how I approach nutrient timing with clients, I aim to construct it in a manner where I do everything possible within their energy, essentially their calorie budget and their abilities and their schedule, where I'm trying within the pre, the intra, and post workout windows to ensure my clients have the best training performance in the gym and are able to maximize their recovery outside of it. This is because training is technically a catabolic process. As being in a deficit, as is being in a deficit. So we have these two different catabolic processes, both breaking down muscle protein breakdown. And so this is where proper nutrition combined with nutrient timing is important, as adequately fueling yourself both before and after training can help get you out of this catabolic state and into a state of positive protein balance, which is an anabolic state that supports muscle growth and recovery. And this is why I'm a big advocate of having my clients have a pre-workout meal and not to train in a fasted state, as the purpose of pre-workout nutrition is to fuel training and provide an anabolic environment for building muscle. So you want to set yourself up for success with your pre-workout nutrition to ensure that you have solid energy and progressive performance, which is necessary to provide your body with the signal to adapt and build muscle as a result of your training. So we don't want to just go into training just to go through the motions. We don't want to just go and burn calories. We really want to, cause an adaptation, and that's going to take a progressive training stimulus and the proper nutrients available in the blood as well as in your system to be able to facilitate the recovery process and the ability to adapt to that training. And then when it comes to your post-workout nutrition, this is beneficial for recovery and stimulating muscle protein synthesis, as well as glycogen replenishment following your training session, which leads to you being better able to adapt and respond better to your training. So when it comes to the topic of nutrient timing, we have research that finds that when they take two groups and have them like essentially follow the same protein and carb equated diets, and they're following the same exact resistance training program, the group that has a protein and carb meal both before and after their training sessions gains considerably more lean mass, loses more fat mass, and drops more body fat than those in a group who have the exact same meals and the same macronutrient, composition of the diet, but they're eaten in the morning and the evening rather than around their training sessions. So this, piece of information was specifically found in a 2006 study by Cribb, where they conducted a 10-week training study where they split, resistance trained individuals into two groups. And they had one group which received protein and carbs both pre and post workout, and the other group received the same protein and carb combo, but it was in the morning and the evening, which was around 5 hours outside of their workout window. And after the 10-week training study, the group using the nutrient timing approach of consuming both protein and carbs pre and post workout had greater gains in lean body mass, greater losses in fat mass, and losses in body fat percentage. They had greater gains in training performance and specifically saw greater gains in their bench and squat 1 rep max, and they had greater increases in their muscle fiber cross-sectional area. So they recomped during the study as compared to the group that didn't use the nutrient timing approach. Yet those same individuals, those people in the other group, they had the same macronutrient intake. They had the same training stimulus. So it's just the benefit of combining this nutrient timing based approach to their actual training program. And so they also, within the study, they took muscle biopsies and they saw greater amounts of myofibrillar protein content and glycogen content within the muscle, despite the groups taking in the exact same protein and carb meals and hitting the same total daily protein intakes, with the only difference being the timing in which they consumed it. So despite macros and calories being equated, the timing of those nutrients in regards to their training and like how you situate things, how you time things, plays a massive role in the gains they made from the exact same training program. So this is where we can take something so simple as nutrient timing and just try to prioritize that pre-workout meal and that post-workout meal, and really trying to maximize our training performance and our recovery capacity as a result of how we pair our nutrition with our training.
Now, then, what would be some mistakes to maybe avoid during the recomp phase? We gave people 3 principles: 1, calorie intake for body recomp; 2, protein intake for body recomp; 3, nutrient timing for body recomp, which I'm a big believer in nutrient timing. What are some mistakes then to avoid during the
Absolutely.
recomp phase? Cookies
So
would be
there
one.
there are several common mistakes that many make that hold them back from truly achieving a significant degree of body recomposition. And these mistakes include several. So we have focusing far too heavily on the scale weight rather on their body composition. We have the mistake of not valuing the benefits of nutrient timing and using peri-workout nutrition strategies to their advantage. We have the mistake of taking far too flexible of an approach to their nutrition. And the last mistake is drinking alcohol too frequently during a body recomposition phase. So, to touch on the first mistake, I find that many make is that they're very fixated on their scale weight and they believe their best physique is going to be at X weight. And so they kind of set like this preset target in their mind. I got to be 120 pounds or I have to be 175 pounds or whatever it may be. And so what they also do is they compare themselves to others and what they weigh. But what you have to realize is that your scale weight is not nearly as important as your overall body composition, especially in a recomp phase. So when you're looking to recomp, the goal is to lose body fat and gain muscle. So you should not be chasing a lower scale weight, as we're purely focusing on the loss of fat mass and the maintenance or the growth of metabolically active muscle tissue, which will is what will result in you having a better looking physique and greater metabolic health. So shooting for weight loss alone and obsessing about the number on the scale is not the most effective way to go about this process, and it's really the wrong way to look at it. The goal should be to improve body composition through losing fat and gaining muscle. So the numbers you see on the scale aren't as relevant as the visual improvements being made. And so often I found that many clients can find it frustrating that they're not seeing their scale weight go down as quickly as they have in the past during a body recomposition phase. And that's essentially for 2 reasons. So, first, your scale weight isn't going to drop as quickly during a recomposition phase as it has in the past when you've taken an aggressive approach to dieting. Because in order to recomp, we need to use a much smaller deficit than you have in previous diets where you just try to eat as little as possible and haven't focused on muscle growth. Also, if you're recomping, the addition of muscle mass is either going to keep your weight the same, so you're going to stay just at maintenance, you're going to maintain your body weight, or it's going to slow down your weekly rate of scale weight loss. But ultimately, you're going to look better, you're going to function better, and have a better body composition. So, this is where we really need to shift your focus away from the scale, as that's going to really benefit you within this process. And I'll tell you personally, I'm currently taking one of my clients, Carlin, through a body recomposition phase, and she's an IFBB figure pro. So during this phase, I've actually had to stop her from using the scale frequently as she's so used to getting shredded for stage by any means necessary that I noticed that during the early part of this phase, being like regularly weighing herself was clouding her ability to see the actual progress she was making during this phase. And that's where real coaching comes into play because although on average I have most clients weigh in between 4 to 7 times a week, for some that approach impacts their mindset in a negative manner. And that's where I pivot to using other strategies like a client's, photos, weekly progress photos, their post-workout photos, and their biofeedback to assess their progress and make proper and appropriate adjustments to the program. Now, the next mistake that I find many make is that they think that peri-workout nutrition doesn't really matter. And from a coaching perspective, I don't agree with this thought process, as you can't tell me that if a client is just hitting their macros and not caring about protein quantity per meal, the frequency and timing of their protein quality or protein quantity, they're not focusing on food quality, and they're going into their training sessions exhausted and fasted after an overnight sleeping period or after a long day of work, but isn't focusing on peri-workout nutrition, that it isn't going to hinder their ability to perform in the gym and progress their training over time. And this impediment to performance in and of itself is going to limit a client's ability to build muscle during a recomp phase, which is why I'm such a big advocate of properly fueling my clients around their workout perimeter. So by using nutrient timing, you're going to be able to go into training after having consistent feedings throughout the day and feeling well fueled and energized, which is going to yield to better outcomes both in your individual training sessions and also over the course of a training cycle. And by using a nutrient timing approach during a recomp phase, it helps to fuel your training sessions. It allows you to have better, more consistent energy in the gym, and it increases training performance and recovery capacity from your training. And these little details can make all the difference as they add up over time and over the course of consecutive training cycles so we can get better over time. The next mistake many make during a recomp phase is using a very flexible if it fits your macros approach to nutrition, where they only focus on either calories and or macros. And I find a lot of new clients who come to me have been leaving gains on the table taking this type of approach as they're just essentially hitting their macro totals, but they're not dialing in their protein distribution and the timing of their protein, their food quality, their micronutrient intake, and especially their peri-workout nutrition. And I've been able to help a lot of these individuals make a lot of progress even when they're advanced when I've dialed in these variables and have done things like increasing protein intake and the quality of those protein sources. I've had them utilize a more consistent meal frequency that allows them to get an adequate bolus of protein multiple times throughout the day. And when I focus more on peri-workout nutrition, especially during this recomp phase. And the last mistake many make during a recomp phase is drinking alcohol on a frequent basis. And alcohol not only has a higher amount of calories per gram than other macros like carbs and protein, but it also dysregulates your appetite. And it's been shown in numerous research studies that due to a lack of satiety that alcohol provides, it's common for people to consume alcohol calories in addition to their daily calorie intake, which can easily put you into an energy surplus and take you out of the deficit, which is required to lose fat during this body recomposition phase. There also seems to be like this dose dependent response or effect that alcohol intake has on your appetite, where the more alcohol you consume, the more hunger you're going to experience. It's going to displace some of these nutrients. And oftentimes people, they lose inhibition essentially, and they make poor food choices, but they're also driven to experience more hunger as a result. Then, in terms of muscle growth, one study showed that drinking alcohol alongside protein reduced the muscle protein synthetic response by 24% when compared to protein alone. So, higher doses of alcohol have also been shown to impair recovery from training. So, if we look overall, like the effects that alcohol has and why we want to really limit it during this phase, that we really need to keep things dialed in, alcohol has multiple impacts. So, it's going to dysregulate your appetite. It's going to hurt appetite regulation. It's going to stimulate hunger. It's going to dampen and lower your muscle protein synthetic response, which blunts or limits muscle growth. It's going to lower anabolic signaling, and it also negatively impacts hormone production in terms of anabolic hormones like testosterone, yet it increases catabolic hormones like cortisol. So overall, most of these negative effects seem to be dose dependent. So if you're someone who enjoys alcohol, the best way to consume it while you try to hit your physique goals, especially the goal of body recomposition, is to do it infrequently and in moderation, and to account for it within your daily calorie intake, as the deleterious effects we see from alcohol on things like your appetite, increased food intake, lowered muscle protein synthesis, and the mTOR response and negative hormonal effects generally come from larger amounts and can negatively impact your ability to recomp. So these are all things like from a nutritional considerations perspective, these are what you should really focus on dialing in. And then this last category are things that you should look to rectify if these are bottlenecks that you are engaging in terms of drinking alcohol too frequently, being a little bit too flexible with your food choice and not prioritizing, food quality. If you're not even considering nutrient timing or you're going into training fasted, and then also if you're just so heavily focused on your scale weight that you're inhibiting your ability to really go all in on this body recomp phase, because instead of following the slight deficit that Jeff or I or any coach that you're working with has set for you, you decide that you want to over restrict or you want to under eat during the program to be able to lose body weight quicker. But within that, you taking that approach, you might think that you're doing yourself a service, but you're actually doing yourself a disservice and doing more harm than good, because you're limiting your ability to actually grow muscle during the process of losing body fat.
Oof, what a good one, man. I actually really did. The alcohol one cracks me up. I'm like, man, I have yet to meet someone who I know has a body like you say you want to look like, who openly admits to drinking 12 Mick Ultras on Fridays, Saturdays. Like, it just
100%.
has, I've never met him. And I don't feel like, here's my whole take. If I'm going to say, and the instance, some of these people like that, and this is what I deal with men, nowadays, they'll get a guy and they want to look like him. I'm like, well, yeah, that guy uses Tren though. And I'm like, if they admit to that, they're not going to lie about the drinking. And the alcohol is one that I think is a great point. People try to recomp and then they don't really account for that piece, right? Like that's just like this piece that they don't even add in. It's almost like it's magical, mystical water or something. It's very interesting.
I think a lot of times because alcohol is such a accepted part of our society and our culture that it's almost overlooked. As it's, I'm not saying it needs to be this taboo subject. However, it is something that has deleterious effects on your body composition, your appetite regulation, your cognition, your brain health, your longevity, your metabolic health. There's so many parameters that it negatively impacts your hormone health, so many parameters that it negatively impacts. But because it's so accepted and because it's so prominent for people within the general population to go out for drinks on Friday, and it's almost an escape for many, that they don't even consider it. And there's been many times within an intake, I take on a new client and I ask them about their alcohol frequency, and they don't even seem to mention it. They say, infrequently or once in a while. And then we're working together and we're a month or two in, and it's like they go out drinking every weekend. And I go back to them, I say, listen, when we went through our intake, I have it on the form, and then we also had a discussion. You said you drank, a few drinks a month. You're drinking a few drinks multiple days a weekend. So on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, like this has exacerbated, this has amplified. And a lot of times they say, you know what, I always did this. I was never aware of it. So really the first key to ever changing a habit, especially a negative habit, is to be able to become aware of it, to be able to acknowledge it. And then also I like to empower people through education so they're aware of the deleterious effects that it can have. So for instance, I have a client, Amelia, that I'm working with, and she's a hybrid athlete. So she not only resistance trains and does other activities, but she's training for a competition called High Rocks, which she's going to be competing in on Saturday in Chicago. And so, she was having, initially she had told me she didn't drink that often, but she had just went through a very, I guess, a long period in her life where she was very social. She was working a little bit less and things of that sort. So she was going out more and more. And I was starting to notice it was impacting her ability to make progress as compared to the beginning of the phase that we had started together. So that was like the bottleneck, or that was the one thing that was kind of standing out, that was a repeating thing that wasn't present in the beginning of our time working together, that was now coming up. And so I addressed it recently and we had a conversation about it. I said, listen, not only do you want to improve your body composition, you want to build muscle, lose fat, but you also want to perform really well. So I went over some of the data on the performance effects, and I just said, and I broke it down in a very simple manner, but I was just like, listen, let's think about all the activity that you're doing. You're putting so much work in the gym. She's doing 12 sessions a week, and she's doing 5 resistance training sessions a week, and she's doing multiple high rock sessions, and she's also doing cardio 4 or 5 times a week. So it's equating to, about 12 training sessions per week. And I said, you're putting in all this work for the benefit of performing well, this was last month. I said, next month for this competition. And are you going to allow something to hold you back from maximizing your potential with all the work that you did? You're essentially handicapping yourself. It's almost like I'm not saying it's completely erasing your training sessions, but say that it's lowering your ability to recover, to adapt, to respond, to progress by 10 or 20%. That's almost like you did 10 or 20% less training. So you just went from, doing 12 sessions a week, but now you're doing either 11 or you're doing under 10 sessions per week. It's almost like we got to look at it like you're almost losing out of some of the benefits of those sessions. And that's really where we shifted her mindset. She's been doing really well, hasn't been drinking the last couple of weeks, and her body looks incredible first and foremost, but also she feels better. She's sleeping better. She's recovering better, and she's very well prepared and feels confident going into this week's High Rocks competition. So it's just that shifting and just becoming aware of these things. A lot of times, because something's so accepted within our society, it's almost like overlooked. Whereas if someone told me that they were, addicted to some type of methamphetamine or something, a lot of people look down on that in our society, and then they would be aware of the ramifications of that. But because alcohol is legal and it's so readily consumed, and it's something that is so prominent in our culture and in our social gatherings, it's almost like overlooked, as it has no negative effects. And that's something we have to be honest and objective about those things.
I agree with it 100%. I don't think people, like I tell a lot of coaches I work with, though, especially younger ones, they'll be like, well, they're just not listening. I'm like, well, no one's going to pay you hundreds of dollars a month to fail. You have to figure out how to connect with them to understand. You know what I mean? That's where just getting diverse. Like I tell young coaches today, I'm like, if there's one thing you could do, like what Brandon's doing, continuing education is a great thing at his point in his career where he wants to evolve to, because he sees that that's a fruitful path to him. But the next thing you do is learn to mix it up with a bunch of different personalities, so that way you can like really go far. Communication is probably the best investment any business owner can make.
100%.
And understanding how to like get along further in their industry. B-man, it's always legit. It was beautiful. I just was mystically confounded the whole time just listening to you. Just the amount of research and effort you put in these podcasts is great, man. So thank you.
Absolutely, my
Where
friend.
can people find you, follow you, love you, guys, ladies, be sure to tell him he's a beautiful man. Like, he's kind of been inside a lot. He probably has put on a few pounds that he's trying to rip off, smoking a few cigarettes, all the
Let's not
bad
go
stuff
that
to be
far, my
good.
man. I'm lucky. I'm lucky in the fact that I don't have any vices, but
Man,
definitely not
very
the
lucky.
smoking one. But guys, you can always reach out to me and find me on Instagram, which is at @BrandonDeCruz_ for any coaching inquiries, consultations, questions, anything that it's a little bit more in depth. Please feel free to reach out to me on my email, which is bdecruzfitness@gmail.com. And just a reminder to all of you, we generally appreciate not only the sharing of the show, you guys following us, supporting us, sending us questions, as well as feedback on the individual episodes themselves. But please remember to follow the show, whether it be on Spotify or iTunes. Leave us a review and share the episode on your stories. Definitely make sure to tag us. Jeff and I know that I always reach out and I'll thank people. I always reshare them, but we really appreciate that because you never know essentially how I was able to come into contact with, a lot of podcasts, how a lot of us have been able to network and meet each other, whether it be the guests that we've had on the show. Jeff and myself has been through social media. There's a beauty behind social media. I know that it has a lot of downfalls and things of that sort, but also sharing the show will allow you to expose others within your circle to great information and to really be able to expand their horizons. And if you find that this show provides you with positive benefits, whether it be from an educational perspective, from a mindset perspective, a physiology perspective, you could have a really positive impact on someone, not even by sending it to them, just by sharing it on your stories and them seeing that you're someone that has a common interest and you're like-minded. They might just jump on and look into the show, and it might really provide them with something positive. So that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to have a positive ripple effect on this industry and on people as a whole. So we really appreciate that. But Jeff, tell them where they can find you, and let's wrap this one up.
B, I would give anything to host a let's talk shit show with you, because I would be interested in the words you would use about shooting the shit on various topics out there in the world. Like, how many F bombs would you drop in a 60-minute period? I'd be like, I'd
I'm gonna
go,
go with
oh,
three or
dude,
less.
I would get with Vegas and I'd have over and unders on all sorts of things. Our audience could bet and gamble. We could give
Good
them a
Lord.
bias just to tune into. But anyway, it's out there. But you guys can follow me, Jeff Unbreakable Black. And then on YouTube, Relentless Forever. We have just some stuff there, but I'll be honest, man, I'm just kind of getting into the writing stuff. So you'll probably be seeing me. If you follow me, I'll be posting more of my long reads on my social media stories. So you might see me write about who knows anything. Like, one thing I thought about writing about was my journey into guns, because like I didn't get raised around them, but I find this whole thing fascinating and I've learned so much about them. I'm like, I wonder if other guys would like to learn about them like me along the way. So who knows? Anyway, out there, hope you guys had a good time. B's giving me a look of shut the fuck up. So we're getting out of here. I hope you all have yourself a phenomenal day. Peace.
Peace.